Hey y'all, welcome back to All About April. Today's episode is going to be focused on discussing the October book club pick of the month. And what book am I talking about? This one, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women's Lethal Resistance by Nikki M. Taylor. She is a professor of history at the Howard University. She's also department chair over there. I didn't really know what to expect going into this book. I knew that I was going to be given information, of course, based on what was out there, but I think she did a really good job of supporting the evidence with the the facts that were made in this particular book. I'm just gonna hop right into it. So my friends always tease me because I tab my books a lot, as you can see, but starting here, so in reading this book, there are 7 different chapters focused on 7 different resistances, and there's an introduction, and she pretty much nailed it in the introduction. You know how when you were in school you learned about, okay, in this essay that's what you get in this intro. Very detailed, supported with evidence. You get the notes in the back of the book, multiple pages of this particular bibliography. But I'm really glad to know of exactly what I was going into, because I showed y'all, like, look, I have underlined pages all over. But yes, there are 7 stories, or 7 enslaved women's lethal resistance in here. And if you are someone who plans on reading this book, I will tell you to definitely go about dividing it up into those 7 resistances. Do not read it all at one time. It definitely can become overwhelming considering how, traumatic it is. I also appreciated it because, each story, in some ways they do relate to each other, but in other ways it was good to be able to see how they were able to show us how they differed based on states, resistances. Did it deal with the slave masters' wives, just the men, etc. There were multiple forms of resistances. There was silence, meaning they weren't speaking at all. There was also women, they burned down homes. They cut people up with axes. They drowned people. They suffocated people. So you're getting all kinds of resistances in here, which is interesting because for so many years people have thought like, oh, well, they just accepted things. No, they weren't accepting things. What she mentioned quite a few times in this book is that a lot of the evidence has been suppressed, meaning she gave us things based on what the newspapers and the articles and the primary sources had. For instance, in the last story about Lucy was discussing how the slave master's wife was horrible to her, but the court case, it literally stops discussing that particular part. So there's no evidence for us to be able to truly understand what Lucy went through because they didn't want the public to know. Right. So with, the other cases, it's really hard to be able to understand some of it because what was the extent that they were abused or harmed? We will never know because that's something they didn't want us to know. That's something they didn't want the public to know at that particular time as well. Some of the punishments that they did to these people, in the first few people, one of the women was burned alive, like set on fire, burned alive, like Salem witch trials. I was completely stunned by that. And then they hung the body out as a warning for other people to not do it. Just completely inhumane. And of course, multiple people would go out, just as they would with lynchings, to be able to watch these things happen. And obviously they do these executions to prevent people from doing it again. But in essence, it frightened a lot of slave masters because they're constantly living in fear. And as I read this, like, I wrote a note and I was like, well, you don't have to live in fear of something when you're not harming people, you know? One of the things that Nikki M. Taylor also mentions is how when these women took the opportunity to kill them, it was obviously very much so planned out, but they went through so many measures to avoid that. The murders were the last form of resistance that they felt that they had to do. They would ask to be sold to someone else. They would run away. They would break tools. They would try to burn down, little pieces of the home. They would talk back, and they would be silent, but none of it was heard. And they felt that the only way that they would be able to become free was to murder the people who transgressed against them. And by doing this, they found peace. Every single woman who was executed had no regrets. Not only did they have no regrets, they also were at peace with their decision. Like, I did it, so do what you have to do. I found that to be very interesting, that they were completely settled with their decision to go to take those measures. But again, that also goes to show that they were at peace with their form of resistance, because everything that they had tried did not work. You couldn't testify in court. They weren't gonna believe you anyway. Most of the people who testified, it was, other slave owners or, neighbors around. And one of the pieces I read, people assume, well, they must have done it because they're not acting like most people do. And we know that that is something that's very common. Everyone believes that your level of grief or your response should be the same as everyone. And that's simply just not the case. So it was very difficult for them to even defend themselves. So they went into these murders knowing that this was going to be the case. For many of them, they were publicly hanged, especially when, the lady, she was not burned. I mean, she was burned, but that was made illegal later. I did find it interesting how laws differed per state. So in some areas, they had a lot of free blacks walking around, which encouraged some of the resistance because they did not understand why they were restricted when there were people who looked like them who had some levels of freedom. Now, let's be clear, it wasn't much. It wasn't much at all. They just were not called enslaved people. They still had they very much so had restrictions. And I will say from my studies, this was why some places did not want to manumit slaves. Manumission meaning to set them free. They did not want the opportunity to seem as if it would ever be present for enslaved people. One of the things that was very consistent in many states, I found, I just could not believe this. If your enslaved person was executed, the state would pay you for the loss of your slave. What you paid for them, you would get back for it. So for instance, I think Lucy was like $460. And Lucy was like an older woman, like she was in her 40s. That was, past her time, meaning she was no longer of childbearing age. She may have moved a little slower, etc. So when she was executed, they paid the slave owner that amount of money for her. Now, there were, in some cases, so many people who had become executed that one of the states, I don't remember what it was, they had to actually stop paying slave owners because it was costing the state too much money for them to be able to do it. I to this day, I still cannot fathom that. And I find it, extremely interesting because, slave masters and their wives who were considered to be even worse than the husbands as far as the treatment. These people were never really charged with crimes. Like, it was, some of the laws were like, don't harm your slave, but it was never, put into effect where they would actually, arrest people for harming enslaved people, which is absolutely insane. And of course, you can look at it as a double standard. So you're going to execute or arrest, enslaved people for the reaction of the abuse, but not, take care of them before the abuse actually happens. It, so interesting. There was also a case where some children were involved with one of the mothers, and they stayed the execution for a little bit, but ultimately they were executed as well by public hanging. So as you go through this book, you really get to see the fight that they had in them that ultimately led to the very last breath that they took. One of the things that I found interesting, I found the unapologetic nature of the women to be so interesting. Like, they went into this knowing the consequences of their actions, and they were readily willing to take them. The men, not so much. There was a case in here where one of the men, like, he snitched on his wife. He was like, well, I don't know why she got that axe in there. She must have done it. Like, sir, this is your wife. You're not supposed to tell on her. Like, what are you doing here? In the very first story, I think the guy's name was Mark. Like, he's like, well, I didn't do it. Like, she encouraged me to do it. She came up with the plot. I really didn't do it. And, both of the men were executed, but they did not have the same level of commitment to the resistance as the women did. Very, very interesting. Now, what's also interesting about that is, in these cases, they didn't even believe that the women would ever even have the galls or the brains to plan something to this level. It had to have been a man who did this. So all of this coming together allows us to see the significance of resistance and, of course, the lengths that they were willing to go through. In the conclusion, I really appreciated the fact that Nikki compared what enslaved women went through to the trafficking today. So she talked about how, Centoya Brown Long, how she was in jail for her crime of, killing her trafficker, and she was ultimately released. But she also talked about Crystal Kaiser. She was in Wisconsin, and she was also tried for trafficking. She was in jail for a while. They did not want her to use a specific defense. It's called affirmative defense, in order to be able to defend herself. And it finally ruled in Crystal Kaiser's favor, like last year, 2022. So she was able to get out based on the same thing. She was trafficked. And I love this connection of past to present, because it allows us to see that, there is still a fight in so many women for different reasons. We don't know why many of these women were resistant. Well, some of them we know. They talked about the beatings and, the abuse that we can assume occurred with some of the language that happened, despite the suppression of evidence from the newspapers, etc., at that particular time. but for people to still be fighting for their right to be able to live despite being physically, emotionally, and verbally abused is not something that they should have to deal with. So I will tell you, it is extremely moving. She comes with the evidence, so it's not like you're reading something and you're like, I wonder where she got this from. It's all in here. It is all in here. And, you know, as you're reading, making the comparisons between the 7 different enslaved resistances of the women, also comparing how they did things amongst the states, it will definitely have you reeling in some instances. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that particular time, I highly suggest that you pick up this book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge by Nikki M. Taylor, Enslaved Women's Lethal Resistance. I promise you, you will not be disappointed by this, as you can see by all of my tabs. So at book club, we all rated it a 5. One person rated it a 4.5, but we all felt that she did a really, really good job of combining all of the elements and also differentiating them. I really appreciated that. And at the end of each of the chapters, she goes through other women who did the same things at different points in times within the country. So these are not, you know, singular incidents. If you plan on reading this or have read this, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you if this is something that you are interested in. We did not pick a book club pick for November just yet. When I find that out, I will definitely be happy to share that with you. But in the meantime, let me know your thoughts, and I will see you next time. Bye.